Hey Mao, hello and welcome
Hello.
to our third episode of Let's Build an App Together. In the last episode, we were talking about the long term goals of our application and we were sketching out a journey, a map with the most important features, and we prioritized these features accordingly. And in today's stream, we will tackle the general development setup together with Mao here. And since you're the developer here, I think you can go over the main points, right?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so the plan for today is that we take a look at the technologies we want to use to build our app. So mainly Vue 3 and Vite, but also in the next step, how we set up our project in general. So we will go through the basic technologies first, and then step by step, we'll take a look at a very simple starter project I created, and we will try to make it work with all the technologies we want to use, and so that we are ready to build a very simple prototype in the next step. Okay, so I'd say let's start with the walkthrough through the frameworks and technologies we want to use. So the first thing, basically the the most crucial part of our project will be the front-end framework, so the decision which front-end framework we want to use. And because I'm very familiar with it, and also because I think it's one of the best front-end frameworks out there right now, we will choose Vue 3 to build our little app. So for those of you who don't know Vue 3, it's like I said, a front-end framework, so similar to React, for example, or also to other front-end frameworks like Angular or Svelte, and so on. So the special thing about Vue 3 is that, first of all, it's in the latest iteration, in the version 3, it's using a very powerful stack. Like maybe I can show it real quick. There is something new that's called the composition API. And the composition API makes it very easy to write reactive code. During the next sessions, we will take a closer look at what it means when code is reactive. But maybe as a very, very simple explanation, it's the opposite basically would be if you have imperative code, like you tell the code that something should happen and then it happens. And reactive programming is more about things happen, and because of those things happening, other things happen. And that's a very complicated way of saying, like, when something changes, some value changes, we change the rendering that what is displayed on the screen. So yeah, this is our first building block, Vue 3, the front-end framework. It's responsible for rendering the UI of our application, and it makes it very easy to do so. And the next part is,
Can I
if
maybe
we
add
want,
something to that,
yeah,
Mo?
please, yeah, go ahead.
Because you were talking about the reactive nature of the framework.
Mm-hmm.
What's besides Vue 3? What are the other frameworks that are very common at the moment, and why didn't you choose one of those?
Mm-hmm. Very good question.
Because I
So,
was like, because as an outstanding person without a development background, exactly when you were talking about reactive, I thought about the React framework, which I also hear a lot from other developers. So I was being
yeah,
curious why not React or any other framework really?
mm-hmm. Great question. So, React is basically the biggest one right now, the biggest reactive front-end framework right now. And it's also the most common one. So probably most apps nowadays are built with React. And for the differences, so basically, the main difference between React and Vue is, in technical terms, the way the reactivity works. So I hope that's not too detailed, but like React, the React reactivity model is based on React hooks, and the Vue reactivity model with Vue 3 is based on the composition API. And so the first reason why I prefer to use Vue 3 is because I think the composition API approach is superior to the React reactivity approach. That's mostly about preferences. I mean, you can make the argument that Vue 3 is also a little faster than React, but yeah, I don't know if that's really what matters most, because when you build web applications with those two frameworks, if you have problems with the performance, it's most of the time it's some problem with your code and not the framework's code. So, but still, the Vue 3 method of handling reactivity should be a little faster. So that's one argument in favor of Vue. But what's more important for me is that in my head, the Vue 3 reactivity model works better. Sorry. So I'm thinking about how I can explain this. Why?
So if I can summarize that for myself without technical background, you're basically saying that the Vue is a bit more lightweight and might be a bit more performant, but that's not really the main reason, because usually the developer is the one who's responsible for making it performant, and he can do that either with React or with Vue, even though there might be some slight benefits with Vue, but you basically prefer Vue because the whole model behind it is more convenient or more suited to your needs. Is that what?
Exactly. So that's a very, very good summarization of what I mean. Yeah. So also the what you said, the lightweight aspect. So it's not only about rendering performance. What I mean, so the rendering performance when rendering new pages or when rendering new components and so on is a little faster with Vue, but also the size of the framework itself is smaller, so there's less code to download for the user. That's also a benefit. So it's also more lightweight in that regard. Exactly. So I don't know if maybe I can go in a little bit more detail what I mean, why I like it more, but maybe just a really quick example. So when we take a look at this Vue 3 code, then we see the setup hook in here. So yeah, the setup hook is where we wire everything up so that the component does its thing. So that's where all the logic and all the state of the component lives. And also a big difference between React and Vue, but recently I even prefer the React way in that case. But it's a big difference is how the rendering happens or how the templates work. So we see here this template section. This looks pretty much like HTML, but it's not really HTML, so it compiles to JavaScript, but it looks very much like HTML. And this is basically the render function. So render function means this render function is called every time something changes and the user should see something new on the screen. Like in this case, we have a number here and the title of a book. And every time when this changes, this render function is executed and generates the new HTML code, and the user sees the new book title, for example. And the big difference here between Vue and React is, let's see if we have a similar example here. Hello world. Oh, it's too simple. Let's see. Yeah, exactly. So for a very simple, this is still too simple, I guess. I need a little bit more flesh. Let's see.
That's the traps you fall into if you're not.
Yeah, exactly. No problem. No problem.
We're streaming, so that's fine.
So,
Take your time.
let's Google React hooks, then maybe a good example. Okay, yeah, that's great. So this is a React component, what we can see here, and the reactivity model works like this. Like here, you have a counter variable, and you can set this counter, and every time this count variable changes, this whole function is executed again. So like similar then to the previous example, we have here basically the HTML template, and here we have the counter, and every time this changes, this function is executed again, and the user sees the new count on the screen. So this is the big difference between those two, is that this whole component is re-executing every time something changes. And with Vue 3, we could say the setup hook looks pretty similar to what we can see here, but it works differently because the setup hook is only executed once. So that's the big difference, that the setup hook is only executed once. So all the initialization code we see here, and in the React component we see it here, is in React. It is executed every time the component re-renders, and in Vue 3 it's only executed once when the component is rendered the first time. And yeah, it's executed once for every instance of the component, but yeah, maybe that's a little bit too detailed. And I think it's easier to think about the reactivity in the first case, in the Vue 3 case, because it's a little bit strange when you look at that and you see that this is executed again and again, and it's not that easy to understand, and it's hard to explain. But yeah,
but I can definitely see the benefits in the Vue.js approach here. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. In the end, it comes down to preference, but yeah, there are good reasons for both of those. But yeah, for our project, we will go with Vue 3. Okay, so that was already a somewhat closer look at Vue 3 and like one of the competitors like React. I mean, there are others like Angular and so on, but Angular is pretty much, I don't want to say dead, because it's used by a lot of
You're going
projects,
to start a shitstorm now.
yeah, exactly. But it's not the people's favorite. Like, let's put it that way. Okay. So yeah.
Thanks a lot for the detailed explanation. Yeah. Mm.
Okay. Yeah. This was about first of all the front-end framework we use, Vue 3, and next we need something to build our code, like. Earlier in the web development history, we didn't need any build tools to build websites. We just had HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and we wrote some text basically and saved it as a JavaScript file or as a CSS file or as a HTML file, and yeah, we had a website. But nowadays, with modern frameworks and with when we build more complicated apps. Like we don't build websites, or we don't only build websites anymore, but also build apps. And in this case, especially, we will build an app. And for building apps, we need some tool to build our code. And we will use Vite to do that. So alternatives to Vite would be Webpack, for example. So Webpack is by far the most common tool for bundling code. And also Vite is more like a meta build tool, because under the hood, Vite uses a tool that's called Rollup, and Rollup is similar to Webpack, but Rollup is a little bit faster again. And the special thing about Vite is that it's in development mode. It's very, very fast. So with Webpack, when you have a big application and when your application is growing over the course of time, it can get a little slow. So every time you make a change to your code, ideally your browser should refresh automatically, and Webpack, or in our case Vite, to handle this for us. But with large projects, when using Webpack, this can get a little bit slow. So it can take a couple of seconds even, or at least a second, or like up to 5, 6, 7 seconds from saving until you see a change on the screen. And this can be very annoying when you want to work on a project. And it's getting slower and slower. And with Vite, we don't have this problem, because Vite is very, very fast. So we don't talk about second when using Vite. It's more about milliseconds. So you can, sometimes it feels like you make a change to your code and Vite already did load it even before you press save. So it's really that fast. So it's really, really fast. So what this does for us is that it takes our JavaScript files and our HTML templates and our CSS code and bundles it up and optimizes it and helps us to build websites, to have a very fast build step and build websites very, very fast, or our web app very, very fast. Okay, so that's about Vite. I can highly recommend to check this out. You will be amazed if you're used to Webpack or something else. Okay, so those are our basic building blocks. So the front-end framework, Vue 3, and our build tool, Vite. And the next step is also very interesting for Raphael, I guess, for the designer.
By the way, before we continue with the next part, I just wanted to mention that Luke, he wrote the comment and he was saying that his eyes are burning if we mention it.
Yeah, I can understand it.
But I interrupted you. Yeah, you were saying that things are getting more interesting for me now.
Yeah, exactly. So because usually when I build websites, most of the time I use Sass. So for those of you who don't know, Sass is basically CSS on steroids, basically. So you have in CSS, for the longest time we didn't have variables in CSS, and we don't have if conditions, for example, and we can't nest selectors and stuff like that. And with Sass, we can do all of that. And for most of my projects, I still use Sass. But in the last couple of years, there's a new trend in the front-end world, and this is utility-first frameworks, and especially Tailwind. So Tailwind is a CSS framework, but not in the way Bootstrap, for example, is a CSS framework, but it's much more, it has much greater effect on the way how you build or how you write CSS for websites. And I wonder if we might want to try it out for this project, because why it's interesting for you, Raphael, is because I think it also affects how you design or the design process, how we work together. Basically, it's and I show you why. Oh, let's start with the basics. So
Sure, but before we go over Tailwind, just a quick question from my side. Back in the days when I did some basic coding myself, like HTML, CSS, some basic jQuery and stuff, there was this discussion, SAS or less, if I remember correctly.
yeah.
So, so that was back in the day. That was the discussion. There were like two camps, and everyone was fighting with each other. So did less basically die, or is SAS
Yeah,
uh, only your personal preference, or what's your take on that?
it's probably the problem with less is that you can't Google it.
Yeah, can't find it anymore. First we start with
Jokes.
Angular, now we go over less. What is the two saying?
Yeah. So yeah, here we have SAS. So and SAS and less are very similar, and it's an interesting story. Yeah, basically to cut it short, basically less lost the CSS meta language war. So there are very little less projects nowadays, but uh, it's an interesting story because the reason I think why SAS won is because SAS was more powerful earlier. Let's put it that way. So at the beginning, like yeah, pretty much at the beginning when those two, let's call them languages, those two CSS meta languages became popular, SAS was more powerful. But then there was a phase where less was more powerful. But at that point, SAS basically already won and less never gained traction. And nowadays, I think there are very, very few less projects. So yeah, basically SAS won. And
So basically, SAS was the first one who launched as a preprocessor, and then less was more powerful, but SAS already had a bigger user base or audience, and then they couldn't
no,
make
no,
the
no,
switch
no,
anymore.
not no, not exactly like that. I don't know which one was first. Maybe even less was first, but SAS was more powerful first. So
Okay, because I
the
remember learning less back in the days, and then some guys told me about SAS, and they were super excited and told me it's way better. Less is shitty.
Yeah, exactly. So there was this time where SAS was more powerful, and but less did catch up and it did even add more features at some point. But at that point, it was already too late because, like I said, SAS was more powerful, quicker. I don't know which one was first, though. Maybe it even was less, but I'm not sure about that. Okay, but yeah, like Luke here mentions, he says or she says, I guess he, that preprocessors are evil. I don't think they are evil, but maybe preprocessors are not necessary anymore right now. So there's, like I said, we didn't have variables back in the day in CSS. Nowadays we have variables, and there are other areas where CSS became more powerful. So maybe nowadays or maybe in some years, nobody will use SAS or less anymore because we don't need them. So there's not that much need for
Some
using a
more
preprocessor.
functionalities are basically available in CSS out of the box
Yeah,
without any additional preprocessor.
exactly. And also the way how we write or how we structure our projects changed very much. So, like in earlier days, we had one big CSS file, and all of the CSS was in one file. And this was one of the great enhancements with preprocessors was could that we could bundle up multiple files, multiple SAS files, for example, into one file. But nowadays we have tools like Vite and Webpack, and those tools do the bundling for us. So, like at the beginning, we had only CSS, and it was very hard to. It was basically we had to write all of our CSS in a single file because to make our sites load fast. Everything should be in one file, and this was only possible with writing one file. But then came SAS and less, and they made it possible to split things up and have multiple files for different components, for example. So this was a great use case for using a preprocessor, but nowadays we have Vite and Webpack, and they also do bundling besides other things. And so there's less and less need for SAS and less.
So there's less and less need for SAS. Okay, sorry. That one, yeah, but I got the point, yeah. And sorry for the interruption, yeah. Mm-hmm.
No problem. I think it's interesting to talk about those developments.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. It's interesting for me because also from a point of how do I put this in the best way? Like, I guess everything in the digital area, but especially development and the whole web and digital sphere is enhancing so fast that I sometimes, if I look back 5 years, I feel like my design approach was completely different, and I don't know how many thousand hours I wasted pushing pixels. That, you know what I mean? Like, that wasn't necessarily a good thing, but we just didn't have another process back then to enhance that. And I guess as a developer, that's probably very similar in a way. Yeah, but looking back, I think, I don't know, what do you think you learn, even though maybe SAS is not necessary in the future, do you think you learned also, I don't know, positive things that you can still reuse? You know what I mean? Like, from a knowledge point of view? Or do you think...
Yeah, definitely. And I think we wouldn't be where we are now if there weren't tools like SAS or less and so on. So I think also the tools that we leave behind us are also very valuable for the. So it's basically it's a process. So we can't say, oh, those tools were or those processes and tools were not great and now everything is better, because if it wasn't for those tools, we wouldn't be where we are right now. And I think SAS was very important, like I said, as for learning more about how to build large scale design, or how to work with large scale, or how to work with CSS at a larger scale. Yeah, so I think I learned very much. And even when SAS is not necessary anymore, it was a very, very valuable tool for a very long time. And we learned a lot by using it. And we learned a lot also for the new tools. So the new tools, I think, are very much inspired by the things we learned from the old ones. Okay.
I think that's a very good mindset to have, definitely. Yeah.
Great. So let's go back to the decision if we want to use a SAS-based workflow or a Tailwind-based workflow. So, and if we take a look at Tailwind, like I said at the beginning, Tailwind is a utility-first framework. And what this means is that usually, like writing CSS, we have a selector, and for the longest time, we talked about semantic class names. So like a semantic class name would be, we name the things like what they are. So like we have, let's go with the most basic one. When we have a card component, for example, we call it, we give it the semantic name, we call it card, and then there are the styles for the card component. So this is the classic way of writing CSS. But Tailwind now says that doesn't scale this approach, because like in one place we have a card that has to look, in one place we have a card that has a border radius of 3 pixels, for example, and then in some other place we also need a card, and it should look exactly like this card, but maybe we need a border radius of 6 pixel in this place. It's probably not the best example, but I hope you get the point. So there might be
You
variations.
basically have a similar style, but you want to make a minor adjustment
Exactly,
for another card. Yeah.
exactly. And basically
Yeah, like
the
back when I was coding, I was just creating another ID and I was overwriting that.
yeah, exactly. And that's what I meant by this doesn't scale. If you do it that way,
Totally.
then and another way was to use modifiers. It's called BAM CSS, and then you might have a modifier that's called border radius S, for example, for small, and here you have a border radius. I'm using a new plugin and not used to it right now. Then you might have the border radius S is 3 pixel, the default is 6 pixel, and so on. So this is one approach how you can deal with that. But yeah, the argument for Tailwind is that that's not the best approach to deal with it, but that it's better to have utility classes. And so you don't write class names anymore. So you don't write the class that's called card, for example, but like when we inspect this one here, or I think this is the code for this one. But let's see. If you look at this one, this might that's funny because it's in here. It's called hero card. That's interesting. So
They're basically selling the concept, but they're doing it the wrong way.
no. Basically, they're using a mix, but that's very interesting that they're using a mix because
Yeah.
Adam Radon, I can't pronounce his name. Sorry. Also, always recommends to don't mix the approaches. So it's interesting, yeah. But okay, and here you see we have this card style, but yeah, this hero card class we can ignore it because it only sets a width here. That's a very interesting mix of inline styles for the width, and then here this style. A
Yeah,
little
so
bit
they're
strange.
using RAM and then they're overwriting it with a specific
Yeah.
pixel value.
That's a little strange, but okay. Let's ignore this right now. But the basic concept is, like we can see here, we have those utility classes in here that we create or that we use to create like something like a card, for example. And yeah, there are utility classes for every CSS property. So like here we have widths, for example. This is, I think, padding top. This is for media queries. So this is for the medium breakpoint. This means for the medium breakpoint, we have, sorry, I see in chat that our video boxes are over the console code. Sorry for that. I didn't think about that. So in our video previews of our camera were over the, yeah, maybe that's better. Sorry for that. Okay, so like here we have padding 8, for example. So there is a scale from 1 to, I don't know how far it goes. You can configure that whatever you like, but 8 is like yeah, somewhere in the range of, I don't know, maybe 2 EM or something like that. And text center to align the text center, and yeah, here we say for the medium breakpoint we align the text left again, and so on. So we have utility classes for everything, and we don't write a single class name like we saw in the code here. There are exemptions to that for some one-off styles, I guess, but yeah, usually we don't write any class names anymore, but only use those predefined utility classes.
Yeah, that's interesting. But does that mean that you are not using any classes? So you don't even have a general class for the card, but you
Yeah.
develop the whole element only with generic classes? No.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Adam recommends. That's why I'm so surprised to see this hero
Because it
code
doesn't
class here.
work that way.
But yeah, that's basically the recommendation. And what they do here to add this inline style of the width, it's also something Adam says. Like he says, if there are really one-off styles that you need in this very, very specific scenario and not anywhere else, like this card here, you don't have any other card that should be exactly 375 pixels. That's this special card here, and that's why he says it's okay to add this inline style here, for example.
Yeah.
But usually you put, sorry.
Yeah. No, but I have to say, really like this approach because, from a design point of view, I don't want to have 200 different custom widths and heights and different headlines, and then someone from the content team is adjusting a headline to his purpose and whatsoever. But instead, you have a fixed amount of classes for width, a fixed amount of classes for text styles whatsoever, and then you can only use
Exactly.
those. So I really like it from a design point of view, so that you're
Exactly.
more restricted to a design system. So
Yeah.
that's cool. Yeah? It reminds me a little bit of like when I was coding. A little bit, I was using Bootstrap and Foundation as CSS frameworks, and they had these, columns for width and for the I don't know, for the 12 columns basically for the grid. And then you could say, I don't know, column medium is 6 and column small is 3 and column XS is 2, if you know what I mean. So it adjusted as well to the different viewports. So
Mm.
that's actually basically the same, but you're only getting more generic with the classes, right?
Yeah. So like we see here, I opened up the width utility classes, for example, and you can see here you have a lot of those width utility classes, but you can only use those. I mean, it's basically in, I guess, in 4 pixel steps, or even maybe or even less. So like 0. Or 2.5 or 4 pixels, I think. So it depends on your base font size, but with a base font size of 16 pixels, it's 4 pixels. So it's you have you still have a lot of choice if you look at this here, because this should be 6 pixels then, for example. So you have 4, you have 6. So only thing missing here is like 5 pixels. So, but still, you don't have as much choice anymore. So you can't choose just any value you like, but there are
Yeah, and I think
predefined
restriction is
values.
a good way. It's a good thing in a way. So I
Mm,
wouldn't, from a design point of view, I don't even see that as a negative thing, to be honest.
yeah,
So
definitely.
you just basically define your base value, and then all the other values are adjusted to that according to that base value, right?
Yeah, that's in general how you should write CSS. That's
Yeah.
not only about Tailwind, but in general you should always look here. Writes that it's a strange choice to use RAM units. Yeah, that's that's like so. The difference between RAM and EM is that both are relative units, both are relative to the font size, but the RAM unit is relative to the root font size. That's the R in here, and M is relative always to the parent font
To the
size.
parent,
So
right?
like
Hmm.
exactly. So
Okay,
like
it's good
when
to
we
recall that. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah, if we have a bigger font size here for the headline, then one M would be much more than if we use one M here, and one REM always is the same width. It's always the based on the base font size. So if the base
So
font size,
M,
the root,
yeah.
sorry,
But in theory, M or EM leaves more room for flexibility, but I always preferred RAM because you're relative to one single value. What's your take on that in general?
yeah, that's so. I have two takes. when talking about that. So in theory, I like to use EM because in theory it's pretty it's pretty nice. Like if we go back to the to the homepage of Tailwind and we look at this this area here, let's call it the hero section. And in this hero section, everything is a little bit larger. Like the buttons are larger, probably. I'm not even sure if this is really the case, but let's say that they are larger than on other sections of the site. Like the buttons are larger,
So in
the
theory,
text
you
here.
could just make the whole parent
Yeah,
some pixels bigger, and then the whole thing would get bigger. That's what you.
exactly. So if you design those buttons using EM, like you define the font size in EM, you define the padding here in EM, and so on, then you can just take this button and put it in this hero section and say this hero section has 20 pixel font size instead of 16, and then it's larger and you don't need to do anything extra because the button
Yeah.
is just larger.
So you
So
basically just scale everything proportionally, and that's it. Yeah.
yeah, so in theory, that sounds for a developer that sounds really good actually. So, but I think that's the gap between development tools and browser tool and design tools. Because in design tools, you can't do it that way, as far as I know. So in design tools, you have your button and you scale it a little bit. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that any design tools have this feature that you can take a button and put it in some context and it scales based on the context, you know. So like in the at least that's not what designers are doing and not how designers are thinking about that, I guess. So yeah, so in theory it would be great, but in practice, if you work with a designer who uses standard design tools, it doesn't match because it would be like if you maybe you don't scale it relatively. So you know what I mean. So this is like maybe this is 20% bigger than the base font size, and this button is only 10% bigger than a regular button. So and to make this work with EM out of the box, everything must scale in the same with the same factor. And so I think there's a disconnect between design tools and what development tools
So,
can do.
okay, but I think that's interesting. So in general, you would prefer EM, but
Yeah,
you are saying you would like to work, or you are working with RAM actually because
yeah.
designers are not capable of working the way you would like them to work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a great take on it. Yeah, no, I don't blame the designers because that's like I'm very much against pixels. I wrote a tweet recently that I think everybody should stop thinking in pixels because it doesn't mean anything. Because one pixel is has a completely different size on my screen than on yours because you have a bigger resolution or lower resolution, or you just are farther away from the screen and so on. So one pixel doesn't mean anything. But
Yeah. Yeah.
design tools are don't in design tools you just can't use anything other than pixels. So it just doesn't work for designers to don't think about pixels anymore.
Yeah, I actually have to inform myself about that a little bit because I'm not sure, but I myself never worked with a different value. And I mean, in general, it would make a lot of sense for sure to do that. And designers are doing exactly what you are mentioning through a design system where you are basically using different components or symbols in design systems. And you nest those symbols so you have different, let's say, um, how do you say in English? Different versions of one element. So you have, yeah, the same button in small, medium, large, and whatsoever.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about the header section and you say everything here is, let's say, medium, then you're using that value. and then for the other parts of the website you're using the small ones. But I can
Mm,
definitely see the benefits of that approach. But I think something like that just doesn't exist, and that's also because traditionally the design tools we are using nowadays evolved from a tool for photography, basically. So when I started in a digital agency and I was designing user interfaces for web applications and for native iOS applications, for example, we were doing all of the designs in Photoshop. And Photoshop is
mm,
basically a tool for. So if you think about it can do basically everything. But if you think about the actual use case it was developed for, it was a tool for retouching and editing photography. And photography is not a vector image; it's nothing relative. A photo always consists out of pixels if you do it in a digital way. So that's
mm,
where this whole thing comes from, I guess. And
mm,
then vector tools were coming, where it's where things were getting calculated um, with numerics, and it was not based on actual pixels. But and even though design tools evolved and they can be now responsive and more adaptive, yeah, there's still this missing link because you have to export elements, and not all elements are or can be vector images. So you need pixels at some point to export images. So, and also a lot of designers, especially the older ones, think in pixels because they
mm.
were used to this in years. But yeah, but that's actually an interesting debate, and I think it would be very helpful if some designers were, or if some design software developers were thinking about these approaches. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there is also a debate if we even should design we should make pixel perfect designs in design tools anyway. If design tools shouldn't be treated as like sketching tools, more or less, and all the real composition and design happens in the browser. But I think we are very far away from that. But still, it's interesting to think about
Yeah, I
it.
think that debate is so complicated because if you hear that from a developer, it sounds like it makes a lot of sense. But then there are here are developers, and here are, let's say, here are UI and UX designers, and then there are like graphic designers who are working as UX designers, and then there are graphic designers from print who sometimes work on, and graphic
Mm,
design is very close to art in a way, and trying out different compositions and typography and stuff like that, and you need a lot of knowledge to visualize things in the browser, or you need more knowledge than you would do with a graphic design tool. So, yeah, I mean, there are approaches like, I don't know if you know Webflow or tools like that to try to offer like a design
mm,
editor with usable code output. But at the
mm.
end of the day, these tools are, I think, also shitty from a developer point of view because the code is usually not really usable. I mean, you would be the one to judge, but I guess it is.
Yeah, I personally didn't look at it, but I heard that the Webflow output shouldn't be that bad. But that's just what I heard. I don't know for sure.
Yeah, but I guess we can move on. But it's definitely worth another discussion.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank you for Lucia for pointing that out. The RAM thing. I think it's really an interesting topic. But to sum it up, I understand why they choose RAM because personally, yeah, like I said, I would also prefer EM, but in reality, when working with a lot of other people, then most of the time it's just easier to stick to REM and call it a day. So yeah, exactly. Pen and paper are also good tool, like Lucia wrote again.
Yeah, and if you're thinking about usability and about functionality, I'm totally with you. I prefer low fidelity sketching over any design tool if we are thinking about the concept about functionality. But when it comes to visual design and visual communication, and about conveying a brand, a feeling, a imagery, then you know so I think this is usually you have to differentiate a bit between websites and commercial work and stuff you use for advertising. So if you do landing pages, microsites, whatsoever, then this approach just doesn't work. But if you're thinking more about application development, then this I think is definitely a valid point. Once you've got your design system down, you can definitely focus on pen and paper, and you can skip the actual design approach because you don't want to, win a design award. You just want to get the functionality out, and there's pen and paper for sure, the first approach and the fastest one, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, so one big plus when using Tailwind is that it's developed by a combo of designers and developers, and I think there are some great design considerations baked in. Like you already said, like you like the constraints that there are, that there is a set of widths, for example. And one big thing is this the color palette, for example, that we can see here. So there, out of the box, there are some great color palettes. There are also other color palettes, and also the system for working with colors like this. You have a green 50 for the lightest green, up to a green 900 for the darkest green, and so on. That's a very good approach. And also, when I use SAS, so like just to show you that real quick, when I use, I also have a little bit of Tailwind magic built into my system. Like I have this color gradients, for example, and I also have for example, spacing variables and so on. So I also use a similar approach to that, but that's out of the box. You get a lot of those checkboxes ticked, basically. So when you start from scratch, you have to think about all this stuff yourself. And with Tailwind, you have a good starting point. Yeah, so maybe
you can either, if you just want to push something out without doing design, you can use the predefined ones, or you can just adjust the values to your branding, basically, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's a nice feature, definitely. Yeah.
It's a more
and the documentation is also done in a nice way. I like that.
Yeah, it's a very systematic approach. So you're a little bit nudged to think about the basics first. Like maybe otherwise you just start with a blank page, or you copy some boilerplate from a previous project of yours, and when you follow the Tailwind approach, you start thinking about the colors, and you start about general spacings and stuff like beforehand. And I think that can be very useful. So it's a lot less work for developers because everything is already done, and the only thing you have to do is to change a few variables, basically. But I think it can also be valuable for designers to have some starting point for a very professional way of building something that,
I like that a lot,
scales, basically.
Whenever I approach a project, especially like a more visual heavy project, after I finish the first design draft, I usually come up with exactly this. I come up with a color palette with different tone variations. I come up with 5 different spacings that are available. I come up with different sizings and etc. So that's basically that, and you can then directly send that to the developer, or you can enter that yourself, and then you're good to go. Yeah. So that's a cool thing to have. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so great. So I think maybe we will try this out. Like I said, it also affects you, because every time when we're working together and you define some color for something, then I will ask you, is this the blue 400 or is this the blue 500, for example? So when working this way, you don't talk about some hex color anymore, but every name, basically, every color basically has a name. And
yeah, but that's cool. So I guess I can just create a component in my design system that is called 500, 600, whatsoever, and then I can also use the same connotation and the same naming conventions. So that's no problem at all.
So my camera stopped working. Just so. Let's try. Sorry for that. Maybe it's overheating. It's getting a little warm.
Yeah, but there's a nice USB icon.
So,
yeah, now we can see you.
Okay. Yeah. So let's try Tailwind. I used Tailwind before. I'm not a total Tailwind newbie, but also I'm not an expert by far. So it will be interesting how this turns out, especially when working together. Um, I wonder how this works out, but let's try this, I guess.
And did you mainly work with SAS in the previously because you were used to it, or do you also see specific use cases where you would never use Tailwind, or what's your
Yeah, my
why
take on
would you
that
use Tailwind
is
now? That's my basic question.
a little complicated, I guess. So uh, first of all, I think a big part of why I usually prefer to use SAS is because I'm used to it. Because yeah, it's just if I'm honest about it, it's if you're familiar with something, then and if it works for you, why choose something else? So I think that's a big part of it. But also, I'm still very skeptical of this utility class approach because I wonder if this is maintainable in the long run. Because what we see here are relatively short classes. If you design a button, for example, you get very, very long class names. And I read of a lot of people wrote that for them maintainability is no problem at all. They say it's more maintainable in the long run than other approaches, but yeah, I don't believe it. Let's put it that way. So, but I can't say for sure because I never worked for a long time on a big project using Tailwind, and that's where. So, like when you start out with a project, with a fresh project, it's always a lot of fun to work with new technologies, and it's always maintainable because as long as it's small, everything is maintainable. And I wonder if in the long run it's really that maintainable or not. But let's see. And yeah, other than that, I guess the best thing about Tailwind is the design system. Let's call it that way. So the colors that I showed you, and the spacing variables and stuff like that. And you could do this with SAS as well. It's just with Tailwind you get it out of the box, and with SAS you have to do the work yourself. But then when you did the work, you have the best part of Tailwind also with SAS. So that's the reason why until recently I was very hesitant to build new projects with Tailwind. But I
Yeah,
think it
maybe that's a
can
good
work as
chance
well.
to get some more experience on it and then have a more defined opinion on that one. And Lukia wrote, it could be a nightmare with dynamic classes in view.
Um, yeah, I think I know what it's meant by that. So if you have so the thing about Tailwind, mm, you need so if you want to have all possible styles, like all widths and all paddings and all of them in all of the breakpoint variations and in hover state variations and so on, I think the complete CSS code is about 3 MB. And usually you have about, like, let's say 20 kilobytes to maybe if you have a lot of CSS, maybe 300 kilobyte. So and with all of Tailwind you have 3 MB. So this wouldn't be feasible. So you can't you can't build a website and have 3 MB of CSS. So the way how Tailwind did it in the past was that there was a build step that looked at all the classes you actually use, and it threw away all the classes you don't use. So at the end, you had a very small CSS file, but you always had to do this. You always had to look up um, all the. You always had to filter all the CSS classes you don't use because otherwise Tailwind would be very, very big. And recently this changed a little bit. Now there is just-in-time compile step, but it basically does similar stuff. So it also looks basically it does it the other way around. Before you had all the CSS and it threw away all the CSS you didn't use, and now it only uses the CSS you actually use. But there's a caveat. So if you have a dynamic class, so like let's say we have with 8, for example, as a Tailwind class, and the 8 is dynamic, like let's write some pseudocode here. We have with 8, but the 8 is dynamic. So we have a with variable here. Then Tailwind doesn't know that it needs to compile this class, and then this wouldn't work. So this is also a problem of Tailwind, a little technical problem. I don't know if you can imagine why this is problematic, but it's something you have to keep in mind.
Yeah. And from an outsider point of view, for me, it feels a little bit like you just shift the maintainability problem from your CSS file to your HTML file. But
Yeah,
you know what I
that's a good take. Yeah, I fear so too, but maybe it turns out that it's not that way.
Yeah, but I'm looking forward to try it out, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, so we already talked a long time about that. So I thought that we would be much quicker today, but let's move on. I think there were some very interesting discussions. I hope of you see it the same way. So the next step, I keep this short, is layout components. I already did a stream about that. So if you want to learn more about my layout components, you can watch my last stream on Twitch. I think it should be still online, but I don't know. Twitch deletes old streams, so I don't know for how long, but for now there's a stream about that. But real quick, I have some base components or layout components here. So so those are components you need for every project, like a button and a container component, a grid component, grid items, a base prose component for text, a stack component for if you have sections with some spacing between each other, and like a text component for basic text styles. So those are the basic building blocks which are used very heavily in an application to build the layout mostly. So those are the most important ones. So when the app grows, you create more and more of those base components, but those are really the components you need in every web app and for every website. And also with these components, you can build every layout. So we have a grid and we have this stack component here. Maybe I can show this real quick.
Yeah, sure.
Here. So we already have the container here. Let's comment this out. Or the browse, can leave this in here. So the base browse component is for text content. Like we see here, we have some HTML, and this is responsible for styling the HTML in here. Then we have the base grid component. And we have grid items. So let's 3 of those. And those have a width. So, and special thing about those is that we have responsive properties here. So we can say width should be 12 columns out of 12 columns by default. And we wanted 4 columns out of 12 columns at the medium breakpoint, starting from the medium size breakpoint. Let's copy this. what's wrong here. Here. Okay, let's see if this worked. Yeah, it didn't. Did I do something wrong with the width? Maybe I don't have the widths. No, they should work. Actually, the breakpoint doesn't fit.
Yeah, that's the demo effect.
Yeah, exactly. That's why everybody hates to live code. Okay, I didn't import the grid item. Let's do this real quick. This grid item. So yeah. So now we have those 3 columns, and when we make this smaller, we see we only have 1 column. So it's 12 out of 12 columns by default. And starting from the medium breakpoint, we have 3 columns here. So that's a very useful layout base class. And then, probably everybody knows about grid, how a grid works. But also interesting is the stack component. And the stack component, let's imagine we have a menu, for example, like let's make this UL list and add some list items. This is probably the home link, and then we have the about and the contact. The direction equals horizontal. So what you can see, it doesn't look like much, but those are the most basic tiny building blocks. And what this does is that we have some spacing between those items, and we can change the gap size. Let's see how I did this. For M, let's make it, yeah, we have a lot of gap sizes here. Oh, pressed the wrong key. Let's make it 2XL, for example. Here we have some more space between, or we can make it very tiny with the XS, then there's just a little space. So those are the most basic building blocks you need to build basically every layout. And I don't know what you think about that, Raphael. Maybe when you see it, it doesn't look that useful because it's so simple, but they are actually very, very useful to very quickly build all
No,
kinds
not
of
at all. I think I
layouts.
can definitely, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Definitely, yeah. So you just have your, I don't know, let's say 10 or 5 different components or group components. I don't know how you call them by default, and then you
Base.
can create custom ones if you need specific settings for a specific purpose.
Exactly.
Okay,
Right.
no,
So
yeah.
basically, we probably, if we build a navigation component, we use like a horizontal navigation component. We'd use this base stack component as a starting point. Exactly. Yeah, and above we can see the browse component for the text. So we see that the H1, for example, gets its font size and spacing and so on from this base browse component. Yeah, that's about the base components. So what we saw here are the most basic building blocks, and when working on the project there, we add some more base components, but yeah, those are the most important ones you need for every project. And I highly recommend you to work with base components and not use CSS every time you have to do something like that.
And
Okay,
the reason why you mentioned these specific components are those predefined from Vue, and you are basically only choosing the ones that you think are necessary, or are these the ones you were using from a previous project, or?
Yeah, I have created a starter template for myself,
Okay.
and
Mhm.
those are components of the starter template.
Okay, I see. Yeah.
Okay, so and the next thing is also a very interesting one. That's Superbase. Superbase, I guess. Superbase, it's pronounced. So Superbase is basically Firebase, an open source Firebase alternative. So, like first describe what Firebase is. Firebase is maybe backend. Let's say it's a backend as a service tool by Google, but this is run by Google, and yeah, maybe at some point Google is known for killing their projects and so on. So maybe you don't feel comfortable using such an important service that is hosted by Google. And an alternative to that is Superbase. And Superbase also has a cloud service, but you can also host it yourself because it's also open source. So even if Superbase is closed down, you can host it yourself, and you don't have to migrate to some other service because the service is shutting down. And I still don't said what it actually does. So if you don't know Firebase, you still don't know what it's all about. It's yeah, like I said, it's a backend as a service. This means this handles your database and your login, your authentication workflows, and also your image. You can also host your images and files on Superbase. So
Mm.
let's
A quick
let's check.
question in general on the Superbase and the Firebase, because I know you're a open source advocate, so it makes a lot of sense that you prefer Superbase. But in general, is there a big hesitation to use Google products? Like from my point of view, if I would have thought about it, like Google would be probably the last company where I would have doubts, because I guess they're huge. They
Yeah,
uh,
yeah. I
extremely big
don't.
resources and are quite
Yeah,
trustworthy. Like it's like using Amazon
yeah, yeah.
AWS or something like that.
Yeah, yes and no. So, like, I mean, it's more likely that Superbase doesn't exist 1 year from now than that Google doesn't exist anymore in 1 year.
But you would just
That's
like
definitely.
to host it yourself, or you would don't
Yeah,
want to be reliant on. Okay.
and it's not only about Google. It's Google is known for closing down their services. So there are a lot of services that Google uh, from one day to to the other just closed down. So even if Google itself does very well, it doesn't mean that they keep up services like Firebase, for example. But yeah, but that's probably not the best reason. I think you're right that probably Google is not shutting down this service from one day to another, and Google is definitely not going bankrupt anytime soon. That's true, but still, I think Superbase is a very
Yeah.
interesting project, and yeah, I also guess that there is a lot of stuff happening in this area. So this what I call backend as a services. uh, there's a lot of stuff happening right now. And Superbase is one of the more interesting services. And why I prefer Superbase is because, first of all, the open source aspect is very interesting. And other than that, Firebase is a very I can't pronounce the word, so I use a different one. Firebase is very closed down, so they use their own technology, no open technology, and Superbase uses uh, uses a regular Postgres
Pro-
database.
proprietary.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I definitely pronounced that in the wrong way, but
you know,
no, but I
you,
totally get what you're saying. Yeah,
yeah.
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so Superbase is using Postgres. This is a regular database. So yeah, I like this approach very much because Firebase is very you have to do it the Firebase way. So if you use Firebase, you're using Firebase. You know, not you don't use just some service that does the database handling and the backend stuff for you, but you use Firebase, and you can't just switch to another service because you're so.
Firebase uses you.
Yeah, exactly. And with Superbase uses just a regular database, and there you can host this yourself. And yeah, I think I like this approach more than using some yeah, you know the word, using the Firebase technology that's only works when you use that, and you can. Yeah, basically, your app is a Firebase powered app. When you use Firebase, that's part of your of the software you build. And with Superbase, it's just one aspect of it, and you can just change it anytime you like, if you feel the need for it.
Yeah, that's
And
a big point. Thanks for mentioning that. Yeah.
yeah, that's the backend, the admin interface of Superbase, and we already see here two tables. Like I created the task table with just a text field where we can add some text stuff, and the users table where you see all the users. And like I said, Superbase handles the data persistence, so the database layer for us, and also the authentication layer. So we don't have to build those ourselves, and this helps us to get started very, very quickly. So I can show you that. I already prepared something, some very, very hacky code. Please don't judge me. Let's delete this again and comment that in again. So in this very simple demo project, we see there are basically like starting from line 30 to line 50, or no, to line, let's say, 60, like 30 lines of code. And with this 30 lines of code, we already get authentication. So we get all the logic we need to log in a user. I can show you that real quick. I mean, yeah, it's very, just to make it work. It obviously it looks awful right now, but that's not the point of that. It's just
Sure. Of
we
course.
want the basics to work, and the basics are we can log in. So when I click here, what's happening in the back is that I'm logged in via GitHub in the back, because this works with one click because I'm already logged in GitHub. And if you log in the first time with this app, you are redirected to GitHub, to the GitHub social login, or you can also change it to Facebook and Google and so on. And then you are redirected to your Facebook page. And yeah, you know that social login flow that happens when you log in via Facebook or Google or anything like that. And yeah, and when you already have done this for the first time, then Facebook knows that it can, Facebook, GitHub or Google, whatever you use, knows that it can trust this site. And I just clicked here on this sign in button, and now we signed in. We don't see a lot here. We just see that the button text changed from sign in to sign out. But also when we look at the console, so this is the code we see here. So this code is all we need to make this social login work. And that's really, really awesome. So for everybody who ever built some authentication stuff, so this must look pretty incredible. And that's the power of Superbase. So, and then we have this little code snippet here. And what we do here is we fetch data from the tasks database. So maybe I sign out real quick again so that you see what's happening here. So here you see a console log. So like we try to fetch data from the tasks table, like the tasks table, we can see it here. And we select the ID and the title fields, and then we log it to the console, like the data, or if there is an error, the error too. And we are now signed out again because I pressed the sign out button again. And we now see here this console log logs an empty data array because we are not signed in. So we don't get any data because the data is protected, and only if we are logged in, we can access the data. So let's sign in again and reload. And then we see now there are 2 items in the array, because now we are logged in, and now Supabase knows we are authenticated, and it gives us the data back. And here we see one entry with the ID 3 and one with the ID 4, the title test and the title hello. And it's basically those 2 entries for the user that is currently logged in with this ID. So again, just a few lines of code, and we get data from a database in our client-side application. That's really, really awesome. It's really simple. And the next part is this part here. And this part is for saving data. So like you can see here, we have here a little input field and this create button. So a simple, very simple form. And here we can see, again, we look at the tasks database, and now we insert a new entry into the tasks database. So we take the value, the title value from this text field, whatever is entered here, we take this value and we insert it in the tasks database for the user UUID. You can see there are still a lot of comments here, because that's some very, very raw code. Obviously, that's not code you would use in production exactly that way, but yeah, you get the point. It's about making it work, and a very, very simple proof of concept, so we can move on very quickly from here. So let's demonstrate this real quick. Make a new entry here. We click the create button, and there's no visual feedback or anything like that. But when we reload, we see now we're fetching the newest entry as well. And if you take a look at the backend and also reload here, we can see there is now this third entry. So that's some rather complex logic we can make work with Supabase with very, very little code, and it already works perfectly. So we can move very, very fast when using those technologies. So I'm a big fan of Supabase.
That's awesome.
What is your impression of that? I mean, I guess it's it's hard for you to judge because you don't know what's usually needed for building stuff like authentication and so. But I think it's obvious that it's very, very easy to do with Supabase. I hope that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I have a very rough idea of the complexity of authentication and validation, stuff like that. But it's in general, I would say it seems like a really fast-paced and easy approach. Yeah, especially if you want to get something up and running real quick. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point, exactly. So if you build an app and you're just testing an idea, I think it's the best approach to work with technologies that make your work very, very quick. And maybe if your app scales and you have thousands of users, then you can build stuff like that yourself. But at the beginning, I would start with something like that, like maybe Supabase or maybe even Firebase. But those tools make it very, very easy to do stuff.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Luke here asked if we can host our own Supabase base.
Yeah, you can.
You read the documentation.
Yeah, exactly. You can do that. So it's all open source, and I'm not 100% sure how it works, but I think there is a Docker setup or something like that, but I'm not 100% sure. I just know that you can host it yourself. So, okay, this was about authentication and data persistence. And the next steps will be the sketching and the prototype phase. So the plan for the next streams is that we start sketching the real app, basically, or the first MVP of our app, and in parallel work on the prototype. And what we saw here, the authentication and the data persistence layer and all the setup, this is what we need to to build a simple prototype very, very quickly. And so now we have the basis for moving on very quickly. That's what this all was about today. And maybe to look even further into the future. So the first step will be to build a working prototype. And this won't be perfect. It won't look like it should look, and the code will be very, very rough, but it hopefully will work. Maybe it's not production ready, but it's good enough so that we can use it ourselves and we can test our ideas for real. And then my plan is to make it pretty, both the code and also the design. And this is then at some point in the future, this will then be the next step. But I guess the next stream will be about sketching and prototyping. What are your thoughts about that?
I definitely think that's a very good idea to move on like that. In general, I think the dynamic from today's stream was quite well. I like that you were mainly leading through most of the stuff, and I could add things like that. So it might make also sense to switch between like design mode and development mode from stream to stream. So maybe we could focus on I don't know, usability or on interface sketches the next stream, and then the stream after we could try some prototyping of these sketches. I'm just thinking out loud now.
Yes.
That's definitely a nice approach to continue. You.
Yeah, sounds good. I also liked today's stream. I didn't think that it will be how it turned out, but I think were some very nice discussions, and very we did go into detail at some points, and I think it was very, very interesting. Liked it, and I think it's also a great idea to move on like that. Yeah, because in my mind, I thought maybe we can do this in parallel, but I guess you're right. I think it's not really interesting for the stream if we work in parallel, because who talks, and when we don't work on the same thing, then one person talks about something completely different than the other. So I guess it's probably a good idea that next stream will be about sketching, and then we move on to prototyping. And yeah, I think that's a good plan.
Yeah, and if Lucia or anyone else has some feedback on that, you can definitely just send us a quick message and we can incorporate that as well. And yeah, besides that, I would say thanks a lot for tuning in today's stream. And any more last words from you, Mao?
Oh, last words. No, just thank you, and thank you for your questions, both you, Raphael, and Lucia. I think there were some great questions and some great discussions. Okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks to you. Was really interesting. All right then. See
Great.
you. See you soon again.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.